11th of September 2001. The Twin Towers came down in New York, and suddenly the world's attention turned to a country in South Asia, ravaged by war for 2.5 decades. With Osama bin Laden clearly in their sights, the US began its bombing campaign in Afghanistan. The Taliban warriors who had promised a fight to the death against the US-led coalition suddenly disappeared in the middle of the night, like a long bad dream. Only in Afghanistan can you celebrate the return of peace with a game so violent that deaths on and off the field are quite common. The horsemen are fighting for the headless carcass of a goat called Buz, which gives the sport its name, Buzkashi. Banned by the Taliban, this is the first game in 8 years, and a bit of a political statement by the victorious Northern Alliance. In fact, political issues dominate the headlines now, and amid the ongoing US-led campaign against the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda, little has been said about Afghanistan's environment. But this landlocked country of 25 million is now facing a crippling environmental disaster, brought about by 23 years of war. The agrarian lifestyle of most people in Afghanistan meant a higher dependency on environmental conditions, but the war destroyed almost half of the available agricultural land. One area which stood witness to several battles is the once lush farmlands of the Somali Plains outside Kabul. Once famous for its vineyards, the Somali Plains today stand destroyed and deserted. The Taliban considered the farmers of Somali to be loyal to their arch-enemy, Ahmad Shah Massoud, and on the 16th of January 1997, launched a major offensive in this area. The Taliban forced the farmers out and destroyed their villages. Their vineyards were burnt and razed to the ground. Bakht Rasul of Logari village was one of the more than 300,000 people who were forcibly expelled from Somali. He returns to his village after 5 years.
منګه چې طالبان نه مخکې دلته وو منګه حاصلات او ښه شیونه کېدان انډیا ته پاکستان ته او نور ملکو ته زموږ حاصل ته وچه میوه او چې طالبان راغله کاریزونه وچ شو تاقونه یې راکړه هېڅ شی هم نشته دي او دا موږ د خلکو نه غواړو چې موږ ته کومک او مرستې وکړي چې اوس په کنډرو کې پراته یي بعضې موسسې دي وایي کومک او چې راشي او بېرته هر وایي هېڅ شی هم موږ سره نه کېږي.
Rasul still does not have the resources to rebuild his house, and for now is helping his brother Akhtar Rasul reconstruct his home. Akhtar had escaped the first offensive by the Taliban and had returned to his vineyards in an attempt to harvest his crops.
دام وسو او دا چاپه کړی وی وال طالبانو بس بیا ختم شو بیا طالبان راغله مونږ دلته ونیو دا ایوانان را خوش کړه او زه بوتلم په پلچرخی ته په پلچرخی کې مې درې میاشتې بند تیر ک ډیر سکنجه او ډیر دغه وال او ټکول او دایم راکړه پیسې م واخیستې رانه او بس ډیر په بده وجه باندې بیرته بیا را خوشي کړو.
Today, the two brothers are trying to breathe life back into the soil that was once the most fertile in Afghanistan. The little grape saplings have been planted, but may not survive without water. The war destroyed the irrigation systems, and to add to the woes of the farmers of Somali is the 4-year drought that has hit Afghanistan. 60-year-old Gulnur has been working in the vineyards ever since he was a child and cannot remember such a severe drought in all his years. His two sons died in the battle against the Taliban.
خود طالبا خوب مردم نبودن. اگر خوب مردم نبودن این جدید این از شیم بعد از جا اول آسمان خدا استاد کرد. از در زمین هم کنه من اون آمد.
Now that the Taliban have left, Gulnur hopes for the sake of his grandson that the drought will end and they will be able to revive their land.
اینا گوش کن. عرض من گوش کن. اگر من تزاد ما خوبش باشه، اینا که مکتب بونم، اینا کار خودم کنم میتونم خرجی تونم میتونم. اگر من اتفاق باشه می خرجی دادم میتونم، نی مکتب خوندن میتونم، نی دماغی رفتن میتونم. خب من اتفاق هستم. برام مدیری کنه برام که ما بخورم. او که نباشه، این تا کم سعی نمیشه. زندگی نجوم خوبش نمیشه. این مدت یک سر کنه میاد بعد دارد بس خلاص. گم از دیگه باز. دیگه که میام مطلب میگه بوجه میگه برو بخیر کابل، برو بخیر بینی راجی. در قندار میرن جگه میاد. دیگه ما کسی.
Gradually, all the farmers of Somali are returning to their villages. In fact, the whole country is seeing a major influx of refugees coming back after the fall of the Taliban. The 23 years of war had created more than 3 million Afghan refugees, whose return is making it the largest repatriation of people in history. But once they come back, an uncertain future awaits them. "31-year-old Hamesha Gul has left his family at the Pul-e-Charkhi refugee camp outside Kabul and is going to check on his village. He takes his 8-year-old son, Shahabuddin, and friend Muhammad Hussain with him. 5 years have passed since the night he and his family fled their village, and he is not sure what the state of his house will be in.
وضعیت بسیار خراب بود. تنها در اینجا بسیار گزاره ما نمیشد. پس 5 سال پیش ما در پاکستان رفتیم، این حال باز بخیر پس آمدیم تا به حال را. این منطقه ما پاکیزه جای این حال اینطور خراب شده و ما هریان مانده هستیم که این چطور کنیم، چطور جای کنیم، از کدام طرف برای ما کمک میشه. دیگه کدام گفت دیگه نیست. اینطور حالی ما نمیفهمیم که ما چطور کنیم. جایی که فعلا این قسم خراب، در این قسم آمدیم، خدا کنه که بخیر برای ما از طرف کمک شود. دیگه جای هم پاکیزه خراب است. در اون منطقه کاروبار میکردیم، باز کاروبار این حال وطن ما آزاد شد، ما بخیر آمدیم. خدا کنه که از بعد زندگی و روزگار ما و وطن ما و خانه های ما پس آباد شود. دیگه حال حسین چطور میکنیم؟
مقصد پیش ما دو چیز نیست که واسه برسه که یک چیزی بگیریم میره جور کنیم، در بدر هستیم سعی که اشتکار کل تلپار سعی کو نمیتو که مقصد کمک شکتی ما که جورش کنیم کلش ویران است.
After 2.5 decades of communist revolution, Soviet occupation, and civil war, in which 1.5 million people have died, Afghanistan faces an unenviable future. The cities are a mass of ruins, and in the countryside, one could see the legacy of the various battles played out in these valleys and hillsides. But by far the most dangerous of these remnants are those that cannot be seen. The lethal landmines that lie buried in the Afghan soil. This legacy of landmines in Afghanistan is the worst environmental nightmare that has been created as a result of the constant war. Afghanistan is the most densely mined country in the world, and entire villages lie abandoned for fear of mines. Amputees are a common sight, and their numbers are growing. Sniffing out these landmines is one of the most acute problems faced by this country. According to estimates, there are as many as 10 million mines that have been sown in over 4,000 minefields across the country during the Soviet occupation and the subsequent civil war. 45-year-old Muhammad Sharif was a mujahideen who had fought against the Soviet forces in Afghanistan. Today, he and his team are in the process of clearing a minefield which had once protected a Russian military base. Sharif has been working as a deminer for the past 5 years, but knows that his team's task will not be complete for many, many more years.
انشاءالله دا موضوع د افغانستان په خلکو پورې مربوطه ده. په افغانستان کې په زیات تعداد سره د ډیمایننګ مؤسسې موجودې دي او د دې افغانستان د خلکو په فداکارۍ په اساس سره موږ کولی شو چې انشاءالله دغه ساحه به پاکې کړو. البته موږ چې زیات ضرورت لرو کمبود د تخنیکي موادو د ډیمایننګ ده او د فاوند ده چې زیاتې پیسې نشته تر هغو د موږ د مصارفو او د اکمالاتو لپاره هغه مصرف ورسیږي.
Sharif knows that at the current rate of progress, it will take more than a decade to clear his country of mines. And even then, one will never be sure.
Infijar! 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 Infijar!
موږ د افغانستان ملت ټول د خپل ملک لپاره قرباني ورکړې ده. البته دغه کار هم د موږ لپاره قرباني او جهاد ده او دا کار په خپل رضا او په خپل خوښه کوو. که په دې ملک کې د موږ پښې لاسونه سترګې او ټول بدن له بیانه لاړ شي کوم تفاوت موږ ته نه لري.
By the end of the day, Muhammad Sharif and his team have been able to destroy 5 landmines. But they will be back again tomorrow, for they know that more than 500,000 Afghans, half of them women and children, have been killed or wounded by landmines in the past 23 years. Perhaps the greatest environmental impact in Afghanistan will be from the millions of refugees coming back. They arrive at their villages to find them totally destroyed or mined, forcing them to live in such camps which put a great strain on the natural resources in Afghanistan's already depleted environment. As the sun rises over the Hindu Kush mountains, one can hear the strains of singing emanating from the picturesque Masjid-e-Shadu Shamshera on the banks of the Kabul River. All forms of music were banned by the Taliban, and they even tried to stop the singing in the mosque, which is peculiar to the Sufi style of Islam prevalent in Afghanistan. Sayyid Abdul Quddus has been singing for 20 years and hails from a family of singers.
یگانه کسی که بساب یار از بین برد، دعاها و زجای ناله مردم از بین بردشانه و عالما به خاطر با بسیار خاطر آرام با بسیار دل جمعی میشینیم دوستای خدا و حال دل ما امید زیاد پیدا شده رفته از روزی که طالبان از بین رفته. برای ما امیدهای بیشتر پیدا شده که ما بتونیم که با دوستای خود کسایی که مسافرای از دنیای خارج هستن برادرای ما بیاین پس به خانه و جای خود پس به وطن خود به وطن خدمت کنن که وطن سخت کمک به نیاز به کمک از اونها داره.
Quddus's compatriots are coming back, but rather than return to bombed-out villages, land-mined fields, or overcrowded camps, many refugees are converging on the main cities of Afghanistan. The war-ravaged city of Kabul has already received more than 500,000 refugees, and it is expected that its population will double in the next year. These refugees are compounding the environmental crisis since they place extraordinary demands on an already fragile infrastructure. The once mighty Kabul River has been reduced to a polluted trickle after 4 years of drought and decades of fighting. Not able to provide any drinking water for the city, the river is now used to wash clothes and dump garbage in. But for the space-starved refugees, the dry riverbed is prime property to set up their shops. Slowly, it has developed into a full-fledged cloth market. The locals call it the Titanic market, because sooner or later, it will get submerged by the river. Gul Ahmed was one of the first to start a shop here on the banks of the Kabul River, with cloth smuggled in from Pakistan.
مگر فعلا هیچ آب نیست ها های دایسه پل میرسید آب 5 سال باید طلب خوشحالی است تماما میفهمه که افغانستان خوشحالی است به خاطر از او اینم دریام خوش شده یعنی 5 سال باید طرف یک دفعه آب آمده 2 دفعه همین 2 روز 3 روز آب بوده آب رفته پس آب کم شده اینجا اگر مشکلات آب باشه باز یک روز 2 روز نمیایم همین کالا تماما نشه شوکی میبریم روز پس در این بازار میایم اینجا.
Named after a disaster movie, Kabul's own Titanic, appropriately enough, is also becoming a disaster. Officials warn that the water is becoming increasingly polluted and a center of disease. The rest of Kabul lies shattered. Entire localities have been reduced to rubble, and the once lush hills around the city stand barren. Through the war years, the residents of Kabul cut every tree in sight for heating and cooking food. Farmlands around the city were burnt and degraded during the war. Today, a large number of Kabul residents are dependent on food distributed by aid agencies. Amongst these hundreds of women who are waiting for wheat is 42-year-old widow Shafika. Her husband, Abdul Salam, 2 sons and a daughter, died in the fighting in 1993. She began working as a teacher to support her remaining 5 children. But in 1996, the Taliban stopped her from working.
درس خواندن میرفتیم ما را استاد کردن گفت شما چرا از این را میاین در این را پس میرین گفتیم ما در این را میریم و میایم اینطور مشکلات گفتیم که ما اولادار هستیم بی سرپرست هستیم میریم اونجا درس میتیم یک لقمه نان و پیسه‌اش پیدا میکنیم دا او نماندن گفتن شما دیگه نرید مشکلات زیادی را با سر دیدیم.
When she persisted, like thousands of other widows, she was severely beaten up by the Taliban and soon was forced to beg on the streets of Kabul. Today she collects her share of the food grain and takes it back to the bullet-scarred hovel she calls home. These abandoned houses were completely destroyed in Mujahideen rocket attacks and are now home to destitute widows like Shafika and her 3 daughters.
ما برادر همی یک لقمه نان و بسیار مشکل به دست میاریم. همی کمکایی را که برای ما از مملکت خارج میکنن از ما زیاد تشکر میکنیم. از دولتش از کمکش از کمکای همه جانبیش ما تشکری میکنیم و در غیر از ما کدام دیگه چیزی عید نداریم و بسیار مشکل ما می لقمه نان رو به دست میاریم دیگه چیزی نداریم.
In the countryside, the scars of years of conflict are visible on the landscape of Afghanistan. Conventional explosives have littered the country. And after 23 years of war, came the 4 months of intensive American bombing. A single B-52 bomber would scatter more than 8,000 deadly bomblets over an area the size of 120 soccer fields. But many did not detonate, and according to an estimate, there are more than 40,000 live bomblets scattered across Afghanistan, all waiting to explode. For the shepherds and nomads of Afghanistan, these unexploded bombs have made their journeys into living nightmares. Baba Juma Khan has been walking these trails for 42 years and has seen the landscape completely change.
با غریبی میریم دی 20 سال انقلاب شوروی آمد ملکای ما در گرفت گندمای ما سوخت بوتای ما سوخت خارا سوخت جنگلا سوخت ما مردم غریب شدیم ما مردم تمام سال میریم با غریبی نان نداریم کالا نداریم اردم شهید هستیم سوخت ما دست شوروی انقلاب دی 22 ساله ما توا و هوا شدیم این زمین های جنگلای ما سوخت اینا نمانده ما اینا ما میریم با غریبی باشه یک سال 2 بار 3 بار 4 بار ما با غریبی میریم.
But in order to restore the damaged environment of Afghanistan, it is important to first establish peace. As these men lay their bets on the warring cocks, they are aware that their war-ravaged country has several times seen peace coming to an abrupt end. Environmental reconstruction requires stability and an end to warfare. In a country whose composition is a complex ethnic mix, observers maintain that peace can never be stable till the ever-warring warlords and defeated Taliban fighters are persuaded to hand over their guns. Though the world must decide how to eradicate the terrorist threat emanating from this land that has proved to be the graveyard of every foreign invader, it can no longer ignore the accelerating environmental disaster. The people of Afghanistan are in desperate need of help to repair their natural habitat and ecosystem. The international community needs to respond fast. If they wait too long, there might be nothing left to save.